There is blood on my jacket. Not a lot. Just a smear rust-colored against the cream fabric, right at the sleeve where I'd pressed it to Graham's forehead in the parking lot before the paramedics arrived. 3 stitches, they told me. He was going to be fine. But sitting in that waiting room at 11:45 at night, with the fluorescent tube above me stuttering like it couldn't decide whether to stay on, I couldn't stop staring at it. The blood. Because 4 hours ago, I found out my brother had been stealing from me for 11 years, not skimming, not borrowing, stealing, deliberately, systematically, with the calm of someone who had never once worried about getting caught. And 4 hours ago, I also found out he had no idea what he'd just handed me when he signed that paper. I looked at the ceiling, and I thought, this is what the end of something feels like. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a waiting room at midnight, and a flicker of bad lighting, and the slow, quiet understanding that the person you loved most in the world had been treating you like a tool for your entire adult life. This is the story of how one garbage bag changed everything. And if you're the kind of person who stays until the end, and I promise you, you want to stay until the end, hit that subscribe button right now. Hit the like button too, because I'm going to need you here for this one. And when we get to the end, I want to know, have you ever trusted someone completely, given them everything, defended them to everyone who told you not to, and then found out you never should have? Drop it in the comments. We're going to talk about it. My name is Andrea Whitfield. I'm 28 years old. I work in freight logistics, which means I spend my days tracking cargo that other people own, solving problems that other people caused, and making sure that systems built on trust actually function the way they're supposed to. I'm good at my job. I'm patient. I notice things. What I couldn't see, for years, in plain sight, was what was happening in my own house. My parents died when I was 17. Mom went first, ovarian cancer, quietly, and too fast. Dad followed 18 months later. Heart attack. The doctors said it was cardiac. I always thought it was grief. He just stopped seeing the point of getting up in the morning once she was gone, and eventually his body agreed with him. I was a junior in high school. My brother Derek was 25. He stepped in the way that firstborn sons in movies step in, broad-shouldered and decisive, with the kind of confidence that other people mistake for competence. He said, "Andrea, you don't need to worry about any of this. I'll handle the estate, you focus on school." And I was 17 and gutted by grief, so I said okay. I said thank you. I said, I don't know what I'd do without you. What I didn't understand, what took me 11 years to understand, was the difference between someone who protects you and someone who manages you. Derek managed me. The property deeds went into his name because my credit history was thin. The bank accounts for the estate went into his name because he was the adult. The warehouse our parents had owned for 20 years, a crumbling brick building on the east side of Houston they'd used for storage, went into his name because it was part of the estate. He used the word ours constantly. We are building something, Andrea. This is our legacy. Our parents worked their whole lives for what we have. I believed him. I was 17, then 19, then 22 and paying property taxes on buildings I didn't technically own because Derek said we couldn't let our parents' legacy slip away. I was 24 and draining my savings account when the warehouse roof needed emergency repairs and Derek was at a conference in Dallas. He called me from his hotel room. We can't let it fall apart, Andrea. This building is all we have left of them. And I wrote the check. I was 26 when I needed a car and my credit score was too low to get a loan on my own. Derek co-signed. He told me it was a favor. The title went in his name, but I made every single payment, every single month, for 2 years. He kept me dependent without ever making a single threat. He never raised his voice. He just made sure that I always needed him slightly more than he needed me. And then, he called it love. I didn't see it. I want to be honest about that. I didn't see it for a long time. What finally cracked the whole careful architecture open happened on a Tuesday night in August when Houston was sitting under a heat advisory and Derek was throwing a dinner party. He called it a soft launch. His new lifestyle brand. His wife Sophie was the face of it. 200,000 followers. A gift for making her life look like an ad for a life. Derek was the strategist. He always needed to be the strategist. I got home from a 12-hour shift at 8:15, carrying my work bag and smelling like a loading dock, and the elevator doors opened, and Derek was standing right there in the hallway, like he'd been waiting. He looked at me the way a hotel concierge looks at someone who has shown up without a reservation. "I need to talk to you," he said, and he pulled me away from the main room, into the hallway, near the linen closet. He said it so calmly, so reasonably, like he was telling me the weather. "Sophie needs your room for the next 2 weeks. One of her collaborators is staying over for a series they're filming. I've had your things moved." I stared at him. "Moved where?" "The warehouse. You can stay there. It's not being used." "Derek, that building doesn't have climate control. It's August. I had a portable unit sent over." He glanced toward the main room. "I need you to be flexible right now. This dinner is worth $400,000 in potential partnerships. Your inconvenience doesn't outweigh that." And then someone called his name from the living room and he turned and walked away, and I was left standing in my own hallway, or the hallway of the building where I lived, which had never quite been the same thing, holding my work bag and my jacket and the specific, nauseating feeling of a person who has just been informed that they are, in the accounting of someone else's priorities, a rounding error. I noticed Sophie filming near the kitchen. I noticed 2 of the investors glancing my way. And I understood, suddenly, what he'd done. He'd had this conversation in a semi-public space on purpose. He knew I wouldn't cause a scene. He'd engineered it so that fighting back would make me look like the difficult one. I didn't fight back. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I picked up my jacket, I picked up my bag, and I walked to the elevator, and I pressed the button, and I rode it down to the lobby, and I walked out into the Houston night, which was still 93 degrees at 8:30 in the evening. 3 miles. I walked 3 miles because I didn't have a car anymore. Derek had needed cash 2 weeks earlier for a catering deposit and had sold it. My car. The one I had paid for. He'd sent me a text. Needed liquidity for an event expense. Figured you could use Uber for a bit. It's still technically my name on the title, so legally it was mine to liquidate. Call it a family loan I'll pay back. He had not paid it back. I walked 3 miles in work boots in 93-degree heat, and I did not let myself cry, because crying felt like giving him something, and I had decided somewhere around the 2nd mile that I was done giving Derek Whitfield things. The warehouse was on Barker Road in a neighborhood that had once been industrial, and was now industrial adjacent. Artists in the buildings next door, a craft brewery 2 blocks up, but sidewalks still cracked and streetlights still sparse. The building looked like a bad decision someone else's grandfather had made. Peeling paint, rust-eaten gate, a for sale sign bleached to near illegibility. I had the spare key on my ring. The padlock opened. The heavy rolling door groaned when I pushed it up, the sound bouncing off the empty street like something embarrassed. Inside was hot. Hotter than outside. The kind of heat that has been building in an enclosed space all day, and has nowhere to go. I swept my phone flashlight around the room. Rotting pallets, old industrial shelving, furniture from our parents' house covered in moving blankets that had turned grey with dust. Broken things, forgotten things. The material record of a family that had stopped being maintained. I cleared a space in the corner, and I sat down on my work bag, and I let the silence settle around me. And then I did the only thing I knew how to do when everything falls apart. I started taking inventory. Not emotionally, professionally. I went through my bank account, $1,140. My savings had been drained 2 years ago for a property tax bill. Derek said we couldn't afford to miss. I had a good job but a low salary, and no assets in my name, and nowhere to live. That wasn't my brother's flaw. I was 28 years old, and I had been systematically kept in a position where leaving felt impossible. Not through threats, through architecture, through 100 small decisions over a decade that had each seemed reasonable in isolation, and were, viewed together from the floor of a hot warehouse at 10 o'clock at night, a cage. I was still sitting there when my phone buzzed. An email from the estate account. My address still listed as secondary contact, something neither of us had ever changed. Final disconnection notice. The utility bill for this building. $3,800 past due. I almost closed the email. Then I looked at the usage graph. I have spent 8 years in logistics. I have spent 8 years looking at data and finding the thing that doesn't fit. And something about this graph didn't fit. The line was flat. Not fluctuating, flat. When a building sits empty, its power consumption drops. When machines cycle on and off, the line jagged. This line was perfectly, continuously horizontal. A constant draw, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 60 days. That's not a forgotten refrigerator. That's not a security light. That's something that cannot be turned off. Something that requires power the way a patient in a hospital requires an IV drip, continuously, without interruption, because stopping would mean losing whatever you're trying to preserve. I stood up. I walked to the breaker panel on the far wall, a massive old industrial box covered in grime and cobwebs. Most of the breakers were taped off, labeled defunct. But one breaker in the bottom right corner, labeled simply Zone 4, was warm to the touch. I followed the conduit. It ran up the wall, across the ceiling trusses, and disappeared behind a stack of old steel shelving units pushed against the back wall. I moved the first unit. Behind it was another. I moved that one too. And behind the second unit, where I expected to find brick, where there should have been brick, there was drywall, new drywall. Someone had built a false wall, framed it, drywalled it, painted it the same approximate grey as the original concrete, and pushed shelving in front of it. If you weren't looking, you would never know it was there. I found a crowbar. I walked back to the wall, and I put the crowbar in the seam, and I pulled. The drywall crumbled, dust and plaster, and then something else. A wave of air, cold and sterile and pressurized, rolling out through the gap like the building had been holding its breath. I tore the hole larger, arm width, shoulder width, wide enough to step through. And I stepped through. The space was dark, illuminated only by the small green LEDs of a row of industrial dehumidifiers lining both walls, 8 of them, humming steadily, keeping the air at 65 degrees Fahrenheit and 40% humidity with a precision that had been maintained, without interruption, for 5 years. I raised my phone light. The beam cut through the darkness and hit the first shape. It was large, rounded, encased in a transparent inflatable capsule, the kind used to store high-value vehicles in controlled environments, sealed against dust and moisture and time. Through the plastic, in the beam of my flashlight, I could see the curve of a fender, Highland green paint, a fastback roofline, a small dent on the rear bumper, specific and unrepaired, that I recognized the way you recognize something from a dream, dimly at first, and then all at once. I knew that car. I moved to the next capsule, a blood-red convertible, low and long and unmistakable. Then a silver coupe I recognized from a Cold War film I'd watched with my father when I was 12. Then a matte black muscle car from a franchise I'd seen in theaters 3 times. Then another. 12 capsules, 12 vehicles, lined up in 2 perfect rows in a vault hidden behind a false wall in a warehouse my brother was trying to sell for less than $500,000. I stood in the middle of that room for a long time. Derek called this building a burden. He called it dead weight. He had tried to sell it, failed, complained about it, threatened to demolish it, and 2 weeks ago accepted a cash offer of $480,000. He had never once come inside. He had not set foot in this building in 5 years. He had been sitting on top of something worth more than everything he had ever built. And he hadn't known, because he had been too arrogant to look. I went back to the main room. I opened the filing cabinet near the door, still labeled Whitfield Properties, Active Leases, and I found a folder inside, Barker Road, Storage Agreement. Inside was a contract, signed by my father 14 years ago, with a company called Meridian Screen Assets LLC. They had leased the back section of the warehouse for private climate-controlled storage, at $4,000 a month. There was a clause near the bottom, the kind of clause that lawyers put in contracts that no one ever expects to trigger, that stated, if payment lapses for more than 2 consecutive months and no contact is made within 90 days, all contents default permanently to the property owner. Meridian Screen Assets had stopped paying 5 years ago. The default clause had passed. The contents of the vault had belonged, by contract, to the Whitfield estate for 5 full years. Derek had never known because he had never looked. He had never looked because he had never cared about this building, only about what it was worth on a balance sheet. I called Graham Holloway at 6 in the morning. He was mid-40s, former auction house, the kind of person who had spent so much of his life around valuable things that he had developed a particular stillness around them, the way doctors develop a particular stillness around blood. I said, I have a cargo situation. I need a quiet appraisal. Can you meet me somewhere unglamorous today? He arrived at 10 in a sensible sedan and stood in front of the warehouse with his hands in his jacket pockets and the expression of a man recalibrating his expectations. You said cargo situation, he said. I did. This looks like a condemned building situation. It's not about the building. I said. Come inside. I didn't say a word as I walked him through the main room, through the hole in the false wall, into the vault. I handed him a flashlight, and I stepped back, and I watched. Graham walked to the first capsule. He crouched down, checked the chassis, stood back up. He moved to the second one, produced a small UV light from his jacket pocket, ran it along the door panel. At the fifth car, he stopped. He took his glasses off and cleaned them on his shirt. That was the thing Graham did, when he needed a moment to manage his own reaction. He walked back to me. He looked at me for a long time. Andrea, he said, do you know what you're standing on? I have a guess. I need a number. He put his glasses back on. Conservative. Quick private sale. No provenance marketing. 8 to 10 million. My breath left my body. If we take it to auction, he continued. If we build the story, the lost cinema fleet, the hidden vault, the 5-year disappearance, we're looking at 15, 18, maybe more. $15 million. Derek had tried to sell the land for $480,000. He had sold my car for cash to cover a catering deposit. He had been, for 5 years, without knowing it, the custodian of $15 million in cinema history, stored behind a sheet of drywall in a building he couldn't be bothered to enter. And right now, he was about to close a land sale that would bring in a developer who would bulldoze all of it. If you're still with me right now, if you're feeling what I felt standing in that vault, go ahead and hit that like button, because this is where it gets real. I had 2 choices. I could go to Derek, tell him what was here, hand him the lease, let him add it to the balance sheet of Derek Whitfield Incorporated. Or I could remember every property tax bill I had paid, every savings account I had drained. Every morning I had woken up at 5:15 to take 3 buses to work because my car had been sold without my permission. I could remember the look on his face in that hallway. Not Krell. Not guilty. Just inconvenienced. I called Victor Reese the next afternoon. I asked him a specific question. Was there a legal mechanism by which I could, before Derek closed the sale, take clear title to the contents of that vault? Victor was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, there might be. Come to my office tomorrow morning, and bring the lease. What Victor drafted was elegant in its simplicity. A standard property clearance agreement. The kind of document that gets signed all the time when land is being sold. It transferred all contents of the warehouse to the clearing party, me, in exchange for the service of removing and disposing of all materials, releasing the property owner from liability. 3 pages, written in the specific beige-flavored language of legal documents that most people skim. Victor made sure the key clauses were on pages 1 and 2. I brought it to Derek on a Thursday morning. He was in a good mood. The land sale was on track. I'll handle the clearance, I told him. I have logistics contacts. I can get the whole building emptied before your inspection. He didn't ask what was in there. He didn't ask if there was anything worth keeping. He glanced at the document, and I watched his eyes move across the page the way you watch someone pretend to read. And he signed page 3. He signed page 3. I held that paper on the drive back to the warehouse and I thought, this is how an empire ends. Not with a confrontation, not with a court battle, with a signature on a document you couldn't be bothered to read. Over the next 72 hours, Graham arranged transport. The 12 vehicles were moved, quietly and without incident, to a climate-controlled facility outside Austin. I managed the logistics personally. We worked at night. We were done before Derek's buyer walked through for the inspection. The building was cleared, genuinely cleared. Every pallet, every piece of debris, everything. The buyer approved the inspection. Derek closed the land sale on a Friday afternoon. He called me that evening. You know, he said. And he sounded almost warm, the way he always sounded when he'd gotten something he wanted. You were actually useful for once. The buyer walked through and loved the empty space. We closed early. The family business finally paid off. I said, that's wonderful, Derek. I hope you enjoy it. And I went home and I opened my laptop and I typed the most important email of my life. 23 days later, Derek was at a breakfast meeting downtown when his phone rang. A senior collections specialist from one of the most prestigious classic car auction houses in the country. The specialist was following up on a consignment form. A collection of 12 cinema heritage vehicles submitted under the seller name, Andrea Whitfield. The lead vehicle had cleared initial provenance verification. The collection had been approved for their annual prestige auction. Conservative hammer estimate, $16 to $19 million. The specialist thought he was calling the estate attorney. He had the wrong number. He realized this about 45 seconds into the conversation, apologized, and ended the call. Derek sat at that restaurant table for a long time after the call ended. Long enough that his coffee got cold. He called his lawyer first. Then he called me. I didn't pick up. Then he called Victor Reese's office. Victor reviewed the document, called Derek back 40 minutes later, and said, "The transfer agreement is binding. There's no basis for a challenge." Derek called me 6 more times that afternoon. On the 7th call, I picked up. He was not calm. All those years of the measured voice, the reasonable tone, gone. He was breathing hard. He said, "You knew. You planned this." I said, "I found them the same night you threw me out." "You had no right. You signed the document, Derek." "I didn't know what was in there." "I know you didn't. You never looked." Silence. And then, because Derek Whitfield could not stop being himself even in the wreckage of everything he'd built, he said, "We're family, Andrea. You're my sister." I had been waiting for that word for 11 years. Not consciously, but some part of me had always known that when everything else failed, he would use the one thing he thought I couldn't argue with. "We," I said. There was a long pause. "You sold my car, Derek, for champagne. For a catering deposit. You put me out of your house with a garbage bag of my own clothes and told me to sleep in a building you were about to demolish. We stopped being a family a long time before tonight. I'm just the last one to admit it." I heard him breathing on the other end of the line. And then I heard him end the call. The auction closed at $17.4 million. After all fees and taxes, I cleared $15.2 million. Clean. Legal. Entirely mine. I paid off my student loans the next morning. I bought a car, used Honda, my own name, my own credit. The day after that, I drove it home and I sat in the parking lot outside my apartment for a while, and I just looked at the steering wheel, which was mine, which no one could liquidate. I established a logistics firm 6 weeks later. Real company. Real contracts. Within a year, I had 6 employees. I found out that my parents' original house, the one sold during the estate administration to cover debts Derek had described as unavoidable, had been sold under market. Through a holding company Victor helped me set up, I made an offer on the house when it came on the market again. I own it now. I work at the kitchen table where my mother used to grade her students' papers. Derek filed a lawsuit. The suit was dismissed in 31 days. He was billed $27,000 in legal fees. His lifestyle brand collapsed. Sophie posted a video defending him. The comments were not kind. She deleted the video, then the channel, then, according to a mutual friend, the marriage. I heard through someone who knew someone that Derek was doing freelance consulting now. I don't know what he consults on. I don't ask. I haven't spoken to him since the phone call. Let me tell you the part about the blood. Because I promised I would come back to it. The night of the auction close, Graham was driving to meet me for dinner when someone cut him off on the highway and the car behind him wasn't paying attention. Minor collision. No airbags, nobody seriously hurt, but Graham got a cut on his forehead from the visor. I got there before the ambulance left. I sat next to him on the curb and pressed my sleeve to the cut and told him he was going to be fine. Which he was. 3 stitches. He texted from the hospital waiting room. "Minor inconvenience. Nothing compared to what you've been through. Dinner next week?" I went to the hospital anyway. I sat under the stuttering fluorescent light and I looked at the smear of blood on my sleeve, and I thought about 11 years. Here is what I know now, sitting on the other side of it. There is a version of we that is a promise. 2 people choosing each other, building something together, carrying the weight when it gets heavy. My parents had it. And there is a version of we that is a trap. 1 person using the language of partnership to secure the labor, loyalty, and silence of another. It sounds the same from the inside. It sounds like family. It sounds like love. But when the profit comes, the pronoun changes. And when the cost comes, it changes back. If you are sitting somewhere right now and you're thinking about someone in your life, someone who calls it family but always seems to be the one keeping score, always seems to be the one holding the deeds, hear me on this. Dependent is not the same as loved. Needed is not the same as valued. And the person who has arranged your life so that leaving feels impossible has not done that by accident. Derek didn't lose because I was clever. He didn't lose because I outsmarted him. He lost because he spent 11 years treating a person like a piece of furniture, and the piece of furniture turned out to have been holding up the roof. If this story hit you somewhere real, and I think it might have, go back and leave a comment, not for the algorithm, though the algorithm would appreciate it, but because I want to know, who in your life uses the word we and means something else entirely? Who has made you feel small on purpose, called it love, and kept the receipts? Tell me. I read every single one.